If there ever was a movie viciously clobbered to death by critics, it's gotta be Passengers. Came out in 2017 and stood no chance at the box office after it had been massacred by what I can only imagine were hardline feminists. If you had read some of the negative reviews at the time, you would have come across all the juicy buzzwords that feminists just seem to love when talking about the so-called toxicity of male behavior. According to them, the movie was a sexist male fantasy, an unhinged misogynistic depravity, the creepiest movie of 2017. What could this movie possibly be about, you ask, in order to attract such hateful labels? Well, at the core of the movie, there's a man doing something wrong for all sorts of reasons and circumstances, and there's a woman paying a very heavy price for what the man did. The movie then proceeds to explore the situation with a lot of nuance and empathy for both characters, instead of just going for outright condemnation of the man. To a feminist audience, this sort of even-handed treatment of men and women is crossing a red line, apparently. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me fill you in on the plot first. And by the way, these critics did not hesitate to get into all kinds of very specific plot points, including the ending, so I'm going to have to do the same. So yes, spoilers ahead if you still want to watch the movie, which by the way I recommend, but in that case, perhaps skip this video, okay? Alright, so what's the movie about? We have a spaceship transporting 5,000 passengers to their destination, a new planet to call home. The total journey is going to take about 120 years, which is why everybody's been put asleep in hibernation pods, and that includes the crew. Something goes wrong, however, and Jim, one of the passengers, played by Chris Pratt, wakes up too soon. 90 years too soon. Once he realizes that he is the only person awake on a ship that has 90 years to go, he panics, understandably. He tries waking up the crew, he tries to contact Earth, he looks for a hibernation pod manual to see if he can figure out how to repair it so he can go back to sleep. He even tries breaking into the cockpit. All of that fails, however, and he grows more and more worried. He really is not looking forward to spending the rest of his life inside a metal box, hurtling through space all by himself. His only companion on board is an android bartender, played by a fantastic Michael Sheen, who advises him to stop worrying and just enjoy life. So that's what he does. He accepts his fate, goes to the many restaurants on board, plays games, gets a better room, watches movies, has a pretty good time actually for about a year or so, until the complete isolation and loneliness get to him, and he falls into a deep depression. He stops grooming himself, roams around the ship naked, and at some point hugs an empty spacesuit because it's the closest thing to a human being he can find. Not long after, he considers suicide by blowing himself out of the airlock. We're talking rock bottom here. But then he stumbles across the hibernation pod of Aurora, played by Jennifer Lawrence. He starts a friendship of sorts with her, which, considering the very limiting circumstances of his situation, pretty much means that he eats his meals sitting next to her pod. He reads her blog, he watches her vlog videos, he learns that she's a writer, so he reads all the stuff that she's written over the years. And he falls for her. He falls in love with her. At one point, however, he realizes that he still has in his possession the hibernation pod manual, which he had used earlier to try to go back to sleep. And he realizes that it contains instructions on how to wake people up manually. And that is when we arrive at the moral core of the movie. Should he or should he not wake her up? As horrible as it sounds, it's actually not an easy question to answer. On the one hand, waking her up is morally wrong. On the other hand, if he doesn't wake her up, he's going to be alone for the rest of his life. Neither option should be minimized. The moral wrong he does to Aurora if he wakes her up is considerable. But being alone for the rest of your life is a form of mental torture, and it would drive most people insane eventually. We know he's aware of the moral nature of this dilemma because he has conversations about it with the android, and we see him urging himself not to do it. That being said, Jim does finally break, and he wakes her up. When Aurora asks him what happened, he tells her that her pod malfunctioned, just like his. Jim is, again, aware that that lie is wrong in itself. We know he knows because he has conversations about it with the android, and supposedly the plan is to tell her at some point. But as is often the case, I guess, with plans of that nature, it gets pushed back indefinitely, and he doesn't actually tell her. Over the year that follows, our two protagonists fall in love, and they have a romantic and sexual relationship. Jim comes close to telling her the truth a couple of times, but he doesn't actually tell her. Then one fateful day, she does find out. And she's absolutely mortified. She wants nothing to do with him anymore. He tries to explain why he did what he did, but she's not having it. He feels guilty. She's beside herself with anger. But then in the final act, the ship starts breaking down in a catastrophic way. The ship will literally blow up and kill everybody on board unless they find a way to fix it. They have no choice at that point but to band together and do what needs to be done. Turns out to be a two-man job. At some point, Jim has to go outside the ship for some dangerous maneuver while Aurora stays in the engine room to do her part. And right before he leaves the ship, Aurora says, "Please come back."
Come back to me.
It's in that moment of near catastrophe, almost certain death, and in the realization that if Jim dies out there, she will be stranded on the ship all by herself, the way he was. It's in that moment that she seems to find it in herself to forgive him and to see things through his eyes. They both survive, and we get a happy ending. I've left out quite a bit of detail, but that's pretty much it. Personally, I loved this movie. Loved it. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it was a solid movie. The critics, however, saw something else. And of the ones that were negative, most of those had a problem with the immoral subtext that this movie supposedly had. To believe those critics, passengers set out to normalize abuse, creepy behavior, sexism, stalking, murder, not respecting women in general, male privilege, etc. Case in point, The Guardian. Wrote a couple of reviews. This one is titled, "Look Who's Talking." Stalking with an S. And the title underneath accuses the film of normalizing abuse. Jim is described as a nice guy, capital N, capital G. And if you don't know what that means, in the dating world, that means an entitled creep who thinks he's nice, but is not nice at all. Aurora is diagnosed as having Stockholm Syndrome once she decides to forgive Jim. In other words, her forgiveness is labeled a pathological response to being in a state of dependence. When she forgives him, the article adds sarcastically, Aurora realizes she shouldn't have been so ungrateful. In other words, Jim is a creep, Aurora is a victim without realizing she is a victim, and the movie whitewashes all of it. And that basic template gets repeated over and over again by dozens upon dozens of movie critics. Jim is a creep. He's a stalker. The movie is a troubling male fantasy. It's the movie version of Grab Them by the P Word and the creepiest movie of 2017. Reading all of these reviews in quite a bit of detail, which I did, I realized that they essentially break down into 5 incremental steps of attack. Step 1. Minimize Jim's predicament. Yes, it's a tricky situation, they all say, but it's not that bad. Step 2. Label Jim a stalker and a creep. If he starts having imaginary conversations with a sleeping Aurora, it's not because he's desperately lonely and trying to have at least a semblance of a social life. It's because he's a creep who likes his women unconscious and unable to consent. Step 3. Characterize Jim's waking up of Aurora as an act of male entitlement. Jim thinks he can do whatever he wants to her because he's a man and she's a woman. Downplay the moral anguish that Jim clearly experiences. Step 4. Label Aurora's forgiveness of Jim as pathological. No sane woman would ever forgive Jim. And finally, step 5. Claim that the movie whitewashes Jim's problematic behavior. Let's get into a little bit more detail for each of these and show you what I mean exactly. So step 1 of these negative reviews is minimize Jim's predicament. Most reviewers accomplish this by A, not spending much time on Jim's predicament, and B, when his predicament is addressed, it is described using very lighthearted language. For example, Time magazine describes Jim's situation as the bro bummer of a lifetime. The Wrap gives it the emotional rating of an oopsie. CBR points out that Jim is fully aware of the immorality of his choice and then adds sarcastically, but hey, he was super lonely. The reviewer of the SFist says that she would have been perfectly fine with being alone for decades on end. What would you do? She asks. I can answer that. As someone who has never viewed solitary confinement as anything other than a welcome break from other people, I think I'd be fine with it. Looking at these reviews, what else can I think than that these were written by sociopaths? People need other people. Not having any human contact at all and knowing that it's going to stay that way for the rest of your life would be absolutely excruciating. And yes, you would lose your mind. Jim is literally driven to suicidal thoughts. But these critics have to minimize his predicament in step 1 because that's the leg up to step 2. And step 2 is take Jim's imagined friendship with Aurora and do not label it as an attempt at maintaining his mental sanity. No, label it as a case of creepy stalking behavior. CBR describes that part of the movie as cyberstalking. Caution Spoilers says that nice guy Jim changes into stalker Jim. The New Daily says that the movie takes a bad turn into stalker territory. Jim drools over her and has a grotesque fixation. Deep Focus Review says Jim begins to obsess over an attractive sleeping passenger. That sure does sound creepy. Again, these reviews show zero empathy for Jim. He is showing a completely normal psychological reflex to try and have some sort of social interaction, even if that interaction is largely imagined. That imaginary interaction is all he has. Why is it that in a movie like Castaway, starring Tom Hanks, this phenomenon is easily understood by the audience, including feminists? Tom Hanks ends up on a deserted island, completely alone, and eventually starts having conversations with a football that he has named Wilson. Wilson keeps him company for years. In the end, he loses Wilson when Wilson falls off the raft. Tom Hanks jumps off the raft into the ocean, willing to risk his life to try and save Wilson, which, I remind you, is a football. He fails and just starts screaming, "I'm sorry, Wilson! I'm sorry!" It's heartbreaking. Why is it that Tom Hanks' one-sided conversation with an inanimate object are accepted by the critics for what they are, namely expressions of a deep psychological need to have interactions with people, and if there are no people around, then I guess a football will do? Why is it that that is easily understood, but replace the football with a sleeping woman in a hibernation pod, and all of a sudden those one-sided conversations are strictly to be seen as expressions of Jim's inherent creepiness? He's doing this because he's a creep. I would argue that Jim here is acting like a perfectly normal human being, and I would say that most of us in his situation would do the exact same thing out of necessity. So step 1 was to minimize Jim's predicament. Step 2 was to label him an unsavory character because he's desperately trying to have a semblance of a relationship. And then step 3 is take Jim's desperate act of waking up Aurora and label it as pure male entitlement. Jim believes he can take whatever he wants because he's a man, you see. He does what he does because he really doesn't care about women, you see. His moral back and forths are ignored or downplayed. Film Frenzy says he decides to wake up a hottie. The Rap says, with little forethought, he chooses to sabotage her pod. Charlotte Observer says, man is bored, so man ruins woman's life. Flick Philosopher says, this is toxic nice guyism. I'm lonely, I deserve a girlfriend, and I will get one, and she has no say in the matter. He wakes her up for no reason beyond his own selfishness and with absolutely no regard for what she wants. The Last Thing I See calls it peak privilege. It's interesting how that word privilege is hard-coded into a feminist's vernacular. And no matter how down and out you are as a man, no matter how low you've fallen, the feminist will only see privilege and power. Poor Jim is in one of the most desperate situations a person can find themselves in, but all those feminist reviewers can see is selfishness, entitlement, privilege, and power. We see Jim agonize over the morality of his decision for a long time, before and after. We know he understands the moral implications because he talks about them with the android bartender. And once he does wake her up, he clearly feels guilty and conflicted about it. When Aurora finds out and tries to kill him, he seems to accept death as a punishment for what he did. The reality is, Jim saw two options: to be all alone with nobody around and go slowly crazy, or wake somebody up. That's a tough choice. Watching this movie, I couldn't help to think, what if it had been me? What would I have done in that situation, realistically? The critics who are saying that the obvious choice would have been to not wake her up strike me as people that haven't truly asked themselves that question. What if it was me? What would I have done? Which shows a lack of empathy, and which triggers another question. Are these feminist reviewers incapable of empathy here because the protagonist is male? In other words, would these critics have been equally harsh if it had been Aurora waking up Jim? Some reviewers suggested that yes, that would have been a better movie. Interesting. In other words, the problem here is not so much the action itself, but rather the fact that the action was done by a man to a woman. Okay, so step 1, minimize Jim's predicament. Step 2, label him a creep. Step 3 says he wakes her up as a case of male privilege. And step 4, describe Aurora's ultimate forgiveness of Jim as completely incomprehensible and unacceptable and really just a case of Stockholm Syndrome. Vox calls it Stockholm Syndrome, the movie. Entertainment Weekly calls it sci-fi Stockholm Syndrome. The Guardian says she's showing signs of Stockholm Syndrome. Denver Post says Aurora ultimately declares her love for her captor. Lainey Gossip says Passengers is an incredibly creepy movie in which a woman succumbs to Stockholm Syndrome and falls for her stalker and stays with him. So these reviews basically diagnose Aurora's forgiveness at the end of the movie as a pathological reaction to having been kidnapped. To which I say, really? When she hears about Jim's deceit, she's clearly horrified. She's extremely angry, tries to kill him at some point even. She refuses to speak to him or even look at him, to the point where they have to agree on separate slots they get with Arthur the android bartender because she doesn't want to be in the same room as him, ever. There's no forgiveness there. It's only after the ship is about to explode and they have to run around trying to fix it, and they only have each other, and Jim has to go outside the ship for a maneuver, and there's a chance that he gets killed in the process. It's only then that she realizes that if that happens, she would be left behind all alone, in essentially the same predicament that he was. And it's only then that she's capable of seeing things from his perspective. And yes, she forgives him, which I think is beautiful. But a lot has to happen for her to forgive him. That's not Stockholm Syndrome. That's normal human behavior and empathy, and putting yourself in another person's shoes, and understanding that a person's actions, when they are at their lowest point, don't necessarily define them as a person. Her forgiving him when she does makes perfect sense. and you can't hold it against the movie. Step 5. Final step in completely demonizing this movie. Claim that the movie sides with Jim entirely and does not understand the moral implications of what he's done. The reader says the naked message in the film is, ladies, even if a man does the literal worst thing possible to you, forgive him. Forgive him or die alone. Screen Crush says the movie suggests that consent doesn't matter. Medium calls the movie a romanticization of abusive behavior. Denver Post says the movie's message is, don't worry if she's mad at first. She'll come around because you're a good guy at heart. It's an argument that men can do whatever they want with the knowledge that things will always work out for them. That's just a load of BS. Nothing about how the movie deals with Jim's decisions is lighthearted. Not the run-up to the fateful moment, not the moment itself, not the fallout when Aurora finds out, etc., etc. Nothing about any of this is lighthearted. The movie spends 31 minutes of its runtime, basically a quarter of the movie, showing Jim's agony, his loneliness, his depression, his suicidal thoughts. He hugs a spacesuit at some point because that's the closest thing he can get to a real hug. The movie goes to great lengths to show how Jim feels. The only reason he understands how the hibernation pods work is because he himself was desperately trying to fix his own pod so he could go back to sleep. He then agonizes over whether he should wake her up or not. Again, the movie shows that agonizing in great detail. When Aurora ends up finding out, the movie gives a lot of room to Aurora to vent her anger. She accuses him of murder multiple times. She shouts at him, tries to kill him. When she tries to kill him, he spreads his arms, essentially accepting death. Clearly, he accepts that her anger is justified. The movie doesn't try to whitewash that. At some point, a crew member, played by Lawrence Fishburne, wakes up. And I didn't mention him up until now because he dies very quickly, and he's not all that important. But basically, when he wakes up, again, because of a malfunctioning hibernation pod, he basically plays the role of sort of the movie commenting on the situation. And that is when the movie's position is explicitly laid out. When Aurora accuses Jim of murder, he agrees with her. But he adds, the drowning man will always try to drag somebody down with him. It ain't right, but the man's drowning. It perfectly captures the ambiguity of the situation and of its morality. That's not the movie whitewashing the situation. That's the movie dealing with the moral complexity of it. And so it doesn't land firmly on one side or the other. So by the way, let me ask you, how many movies do you know that have that kind of moral depth and complexity? And why is it that critics got this movie so wrong? How do we go from Jim wakes up in space, comes to the horrible realization that he's going to be alone for the rest of his life, is driven to depression and suicidal thoughts, starts an imaginary friendship with one of the other sleepers in order to have a modicum of mental stimulation and not go completely crazy, realizes he can wake her up, agonizes over waking her up, wakes her up, she finds out what he did, she's furious, he feels terrible, and after a dangerous stunt by Jim outside the ship, which is on the verge of exploding, Aurora realizes that what Jim did was out of desperation and not out of malice, and so she forgives him. How did the critics go from that to man wakes up in space? Sure, it's a bummer, but it's all right. He can go read a book or whatever, but man sees unconscious hottie who cannot refuse his advances. Perfect. Creep that he is, man starts stalking woman by watching her vlogs. Man realizes he could sabotage her pod, and of course he does, because, male privilege and all that. Anyway, he wakes her up, They end up having a romantic relationship, which is creepy as F. The sex they have is essentially assault because it's based on a lie. When Aurora finds out the truth, sure, she's angry for a little bit, but she forgives him very quickly, and really for no discernible reason whatsoever other than some sort of pathology, because the movie wants to rush to a happy ending. And if the movie has to whitewash abuse and murder to get there, then so be it, because the movie's a toxic piece of garbage that thinks consent doesn't matter. How did we go from one to the other? It's not a rhetorical question. How did we go from one to the other? I think there's only one possible answer. And I know you think I'm going to say feminism, but it's not even that. It's fanatical feminism. It's hardline feminism. It's man-hating feminism. It has to be. To call it simply feminism doesn't do justice to what these types of feminists are really like. Has Jim taken away Aurora's future by waking her up? Yes. Is that morally wrong? Yes. Does it need to be pointed out? Yes. But to see nothing else, to reduce the whole plot to, as one of the reviewers said, man is bored, man destroys woman, and make complete and utter abstraction of the man's perspective and his difficulties, is not just feminism, it's an extreme form of that ideology that envisions a world where men just don't matter. It doesn't matter what they're going through. They deserve no empathy, no understanding, no perspective. They are, in a word, the enemy. Let me share one last quote with you that really illustrates the hostility that was heaped on our poor male protagonist. A reviewer for the website Refinery29 wrote how it was impossible for her to sympathize with Jim. Near the conclusion of the article, she then adds, "There is a way for movies to make their audiences care about characters whose actions are morally questionable. Inglourious Bastards, for example, had me rooting for a Nazi commander." So, Nazi commander, yes. Jim from the movie Passengers, no. I'm not even going to try to understand the sort of logic you'd have to engage in to say something like that. But you're obviously out of your damn mind. Anyway, that's it for me. As you can see, I'm a small channel. If you decide to hit that subscribe button, you will have my eternal thanks, and see you next time.